coming in, and for most of the colleague of mine, these days. Well, maybe not retired by trade, but we're part of the same team from the history department a long time ago in my case. But there you go. So it's nice to have you here, and I'd like to introduce you to Emerita. Got it right?
No, Professor Emerita.
Oh, Professor Emerita.
You've got to put the adjective after the noun.
Oh, my Latin was never very good. That's why she's done it, see, because she had this very fierce, tiny Latin teacher. She was terrified at school, and so she wanted to be right when she retired. So they call me Emeritus Professor, da-da-da, but she's called Professor Emerita, da-da-da. So,
according to my university, but that's right. Me and Anne Kurthorpe's, we're sticking to our Latin teachers.
Anyway, she's from the University of Technology in Sydney, and is a little bit different from a lot of Australian historians of my generation and hers. We're about the same age. I'm a bit older, but anyway. And in that she did a lot of work early on Aboriginal history, which is one reason why I've always been interested in some of her work. And we done two big judgings together, Ernest Scott, and after that, one in environmental and public history. And it was a delight. We actually communicated very well, even though we're far away, used Zoom a bit, and agreed pretty much about almost everything, which is extraordinary, really, across all that water. But maybe that's what it was, the distance, the water. But anyway, it worked, and so it's great to have her here. I was hoping she could get down. She's working on very interesting communist feminists who are a group of people who wouldn't associate with New Zealand particularly. But there's some stuff in the Hocken, and she's been looking at that. And all her work interconnects in fascinating ways. So gender is an important part of work, but so is race, amongst the big themes. And you'll hear a lot more about that. But she's also an environmental historian, which of course is something that we have in common. So she's going to talk about those elements as well today. And she's talking about an important river that runs near Sydney called the George. And of course, lots of Aboriginal communities there. So we're going to hear a lot about environment, race and gender in the next little while, as you can sort of see, and class as well. So most of the big ones are there. So I'll hand over to her with great pleasure and leave it in her good hands. And thank you for those of you who've come on.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. It's really lovely to be here. It's good to be here. This is the first time I've ever been to the South Island. I've been to Wellington a few times. So this is the first time I've been down here. It's good to be here on Maori land, and I'm incredibly grateful for both the Centre for inviting me and for Tom for organising this visit and this talk, and these lovely experiences we've had across the water, co-judging, which has been really fascinating. So I'm a historian by training, and I know this is a centre for sustainability, and many of you are working in areas which look to the future and look to engagement with the way things may be organised or managed now in order to build a more sustainable future. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to be using a case study to talk about justice and sustainability, about where we want to go with sustainability, how just can we make it. Building better futures would be the way to put it, really, environmentally and socially. But I'll be talking about a case study that you may not know too much about, which is in Sydney, and it's been an area of my work, and it's also the area where I grew up on the Georges River. And I'll be talking about change. As a historian, I think one of the critical things that all my work as a historian and as an environmental historian has done has been to highlight change. So it problematizes, like William Cronin, it problematizes that idea that there is some pristine, static past of nature, because there isn't. There has always been change in both the human and the non-human, the more than human world. And it's that factor and element of change that I'm going to be looking at today. I'm going to be talking about our 4 human communities on the Georges River. I'll show you a map of the Georges River in a moment, and 2 botanical ones. And I want to look at the way they have interrelated in, which is the way I see environmental history working. And what I suggest ultimately is that both sustainability and justice requires us to recognise the ignored or forgotten voices of all of them. And that's why we need history, because we can't assume that what we see in front of us is what has always been. We have to recognise the processes of change. Now, if I can make this work, while you may not know about the Georges River, you might know a bit more about this. This was the infamous Cronulla riot in 2005. And it was an area in Sydney, it's a beach area. It's an area, as you can see from that picture, which is certainly about gender, but it's also about nationalism and white Australian settler identity. And why was it at Cronulla? It was at Cronulla because Cronulla is a beach, and it's in fact the one beach that has a railway line that goes to it, directly right along the Georges River. And in fact, from that railway line goes through Bankstown, and it comes through all of the areas which are described by people who live on the north side of Sydney as Westies, even though we wouldn't see ourselves as Westies, we're actually from the south. But that beach was regarded as an iconic Australian beach, and the white settler descendants, the young people who were surfing there and swimming there and who saw themselves as owning Australia, regarded that as an iconic place. And that sign, you may not be able to decipher it, but what it says is foreigner Lebanese people, take care. And it's not a caution, it's a threat. And this riot was very much against Arabic-speaking people of a range of religions who were visibly present on this beach. And it was white settler, Anglo-settler community descendants who regarded this beach as iconic Australia, and in their view, Australia was white. It didn't include people from the Middle East. And that's why that sign is there. That's why the riot occurred at that place. Now, to give you a glimpse of my introduction to environmental history, the people that I've been most influenced by haven't necessarily been historians, although I've had enormous benefit from getting to know Tom Griffith and Libby Robin and a number of other Australian environmental historians who are really good. But the geographer Doreen Massey and Ben Regali and others who have followed on her work in geography argue that there is not one single meaning for any place. Now that would be disputed by the people who were involved in the riot, the perpetrators in 2005 at Cronulla. They argue that there is a single meaning for any place. And indeed, many environmentalists would argue that there is a single meaning for any place too. But historians and historical geographers like Doreen Massey point out that places, the meaning of places is built up of both our experiences there and our memories. What do we bring to these places? And for migrants, those memories may relate to other places in distant lands, and they certainly do in Australia, as well as the experiences we have in those places. So Doreen Massey's work in her book Space, Place and Gender, which is a set of essays, which is, if you haven't looked at it, is really worth looking at, I'm sure you have. And Ben Regali's recent work, more recent work in relation to immigrant groups in the UK has been important. So if we're thinking about, as environmental historians, human relationships with the more than human world, the world in which we are involved as humans in a broader range of species, then we need to ask how do we become more sensitive? And the argument that I've drawn on has been Seth Allow's work. Now, Seth Allow is actually an environmental psychologist, and she's looked at the reasons that people bring to decisions to care for land. to make more environmentally sustainable decisions. And she argues that what builds attachment, what builds the desire to care for environments and places is attachment, and that what builds that best is sharing social experiences with people for whom we care. So meaningful social experiences, and I call that sociality, as would others in other ones. But Cephalow's work has been really important in allowing us to think about the ways in which people build that desire to make environmental changes, to make a more sustainable and a more just world. Now, this is that's a very strange, that map is on the wrong side, but anyway, the photograph isn't. The photograph is an aerial shot from a long way up, satellite, I guess, of Sydney. And it just shows you, Sydney is where the red dot, that's the centre of Sydney. This is a part of the coast which shows you the eastern beaches and the Georges River. Now, this is an area which is, Sydney's, if you look at a map of Sydney, you see roads and suburbs, but if you look at this sort of map, you see rivers, and that's actually what Sydney is. Sydney is built on a set of rivers. There's rivers to the west, there's rivers to the north, rivers to the south, and there's valleys and water courses throughout the city. It's not as hilly as Dunedin or indeed as Wellington, but nevertheless, it's got a very active geography, and water runs through it and has shaped it. And that map, if it weren't on its side, would show you that the area down here, and I think you can see my cursor. No, you can't see my cursor either. Okay, there's a better map, next one, which may be it's in the right orientation. Okay, this is the Georges River. So you can see Sydney is still up there at the top there. That's Port Jackson, Sydney Harbour. And the green dots are wetlands, and they're just really mostly those on the northern side of the river that have been researching about most directly recently. And this is as are a lot of the Sydney rivers with lots of wetlands, lots of swamps, sandy land, particularly along the Georges River. So it's not particularly good farming land for European farmers at all. But it's got lots of spaces and lots of creeks and lots of water. Now, to give you a sense of country and people, the people who own this country on the northern side of the Georges River are Darug-speaking people. So this is Darug country, and the Darug country goes all the way up to the Little Mountains in just west of Sydney. And to the south, it's Dharawal country. And Dharawal country goes down to Wollongong, which some of you may know. In fact, I gather from Wollongong University teaching. So those to the west is Gundungurra country. And this is an area that some of you will know well. This is Sydney Airport in the present day, protruding into Botany Bay, now called Gamay. So those wetlands areas, the green ones, are made up, as they probably are here, of certainly along the Georges River. And I might point out just the far side of the D in Darug, you can see Bankstown, and you can see Salt Pan Creek, which runs down it. The term salt pan relates to the marshes and the wetlands rather than to any panning of salt, which was occurring. The words were using, the term was used very early. That's the area that I came from. So I grew up on the western side of Salt Pan Creek. And I've since been working with a cultural geographer and other historians to look at the ways in which different groups of people understand the country along that area. Now, the wetlands have been a big part of consciousness in that area because it wasn't rich land in the sense that Europeans recognised. It was sandy soil with lots of swamps and marshlands. It didn't become taken up, even though it was granted away by governors very early. It wasn't taken up for farming. So there were not only the wetlands, there were lots of coves and lots of spaces which weren't colonised. And often those are around or near the wetlands. The wetlands themselves were made up, as they are in south here in Dunedin, of large areas of salt marsh, and fringing the water were mangroves. Now, mangroves are much more common in the north of Australia, and they grow into extensive forest areas. Around Sydney, they're narrow, they're along the margins of the waterline. So the wetlands are made up of both the salt marsh, which is not very significant, and the Sydney area is the sort of northernmost area of its range. So there's not many flowers, and it's pretty unobtrusive, sort of, reedy stuff. And the samphire, as it's called, is a sort of a succulent, which is good for salads, and it turns red when it's ripe, but otherwise it's not very colourful. And then you have the mangroves along the edges. That division between the mangroves and the salt marsh is always quite distinct, but it moves backwards and forwards. And there's been some good studies about the archaeology of these wetlands and the ways in which different conditions lead to different proportions of mangroves and salt marsh areas. The Aboriginal languages I've shown you, and all along this river, what there were middens, which were rubbish heaps, really, of shells from Aboriginal community feasting. So people would be gathering, harvesting mussels and other shellfish, oysters from along the river, and they'd be eating them in large groups of people, and the rubbish, the shells, would be thrown into the middens. So the middens are still there. They survived, and you can see these along the shoreline. And what they suggest is not only the rich harvesting that was occurring by Darug and Darawal people, but the sociality of those feasts, of that sharing of food. And I think the middens are an important sign for us of the sociality of Indigenous people's presence and ownership on the river. Now, the next few slides are about Indigenous peoples, and there were a series of conflicts along the river in the very early days of European settlement. And European Anglo-settlers really stopped seeing Indigenous people. They sort of thought they weren't there anymore. There'd been some conflicts, there'd been some killings, there'd been deaths because of viral infections. And Indigenous people weren't so visible. So Darug and Darawal people weren't so visible anymore in that area. But I want to suggest that, in fact, they had a number of strategies for staying on country. The people who, the owners, the Darug and the Darawal people, were severely impacted by viral diseases and by the impact of violent invasion. But they were also, they continued to have an interest in that country. It was their country. And these are the strategies that they used for staying on that country. And as I've said, there were lots of spaces that weren't colonised. Those yellow circles are areas where we know there were people living. And the reason we know about them, this is one of the strategies, which is travelling along the river. Biddy Giles is the woman in the centre of that photograph that's taken in the 1860s at Seagrania, which is on the southern side of the Georges River. And Biddy Giles, by this stage, had become the partner of an Englishman called Billy Giles, and they lived on the southern shore. We think where that brown circle is, but we think that Biddy probably came from further east, from the southern shore of Gamay, Botany Bay, which is where she had the most detailed knowledge. We know a lot about Biddy because she set up as a sort of eco-tourism guide. And where you had Anglo settlers from Sydney wanting to go to Wollongong, they were often interested in fishing and hunting. And Biddy was able to offer guiding for that. And she would tell stories about country. She would explain to people where the best fishing and the best hunting spots were. And of course, a lot of these travellers would write travel diaries. So we have actually lots of information about Biddy. And we even have this photograph of her. She's here with one of her brothers and with other family members. This is the 1860s, and two of the people in that photograph, particularly the bloke in the police uniform on the far side, come from Western Australia. So in the 1860s, there are already significant movements on shipping and overland of Indigenous people from other countries. They're coming to Sydney for this work. There's spaces and there's communities like that in which Billy was living here, and she and Billy lived on that area on Mill Creek where the Brown Circle is. So we know a lot about Billy's travels, but we also know about the people she visited because of these travellers' diaries. So it's a really lovely insight into the sort of strategies that people were using to stay on country. They were going to those places which weren't intensely colonised, and they were hanging out on their own country. But they were still there, they just weren't being seen by the settlers. Another strategy was squatting on blocks of land and actually purchasing the blocks. Aboriginal people were involved in the economy, the labouring economy, and they were accumulating money in other ways. They were, in some cases, working with missionaries and buying small blocks of land. So Ellen Anderson, she married Huey Anderson. Ellen Anderson was Biddy's daughter, and she was removed by the government down to Cumragunja on the Murray River on the border with Victoria. And she married Huey there. And so Huey is a Yorta man. Ellen is Dharawal, and they come back up. Huey's a very good Christian, and there is they have a sort of a Christian camp at the Kangaroo Valley, and then they come up and they set up, and they have quite a lot to do with the missionaries at Saltcoombe Creek, but they also develop a community, so there are a lot of people who camp on the property. And so it forms a community, and I've interviewed some of the people who were there as young men who travelled to work in the city on some of the projects that were going on. So again, we know a bit about William Rowley, who was another Dharawal man who came from Tara Point, which is where that second yellow circle is in Gamay, really, and it's an area that ended up becoming a conservation zone. But William Rowley comes from there. He purchased a block alongside Ellen and Huey's, and together this formed a free community. This was an area where the police weren't welcome, where Indigenous people were able to protect their kids, and they were able to talk to each other. So people like Ellen were able to explain to people what the history of the area was, what the meaning of the country was. And William Rowley was able to talk to people about further down the river. Now, by 1925, we've got this bunch of people, these young kids who are on Saltcoombe Creek. And if you look across there, you'll see there's not too many mangroves there at the time. And the two little kids at the front are Ellen's grandchildren. They were her youngest daughter's children. And I interviewed Ellen Jr., the little girl in the white frilly dress, and Tom Williams Jr. Is her little brother standing next to her, and he will come to him in the next slide. He was a significant Aboriginal activist in the 1960s and 70s, whom I didn't get to interview, but I know his son very well. So you can see this is a complex group of people. They have backgrounds that come from Yorta country on Cumragunja on the Murray River, from places in Western Australia, from there's ancestry which goes to Ireland and Scotland, as well as to Dharawal and Dharawal peoples. This is a complex community. But what is happening as well is that people are growing up on country and they are learning the stories of country. And one example is Ellen there. At this stage, you know, early 1900s, white Australian settlers, including people like my grandparents, are really interested in floral nationalism. And I'm sure you'll be aware of this sort of stuff. Wattles, waratahs, gum leaves, you know, the whole deal, were seen as symbols of an Australian identity which was not English. It was seen as a way of identifying with the place, an Australian identity. And Ellen, better the entrepreneur, was able to gather bush flowers from these sandy ridges and sell them to the local settlers, who were very eager to decorate their houses with wattles and waratahs and other types of native and endemic vegetation, because it demonstrated Australianness, Australian identity. But at the same time, young Ellen, her granddaughter, has told me how her grandmother would teach them about the medicinal uses of different plants. She'd be teaching them the knowledge of that Indigenous Thurrock people had, and Dharawal people had, of the botany of the area, the ways in which plants and animals could be used in engagement with human populations and communities for medicinal uses and for food and for other things. So we know from Ellen Jr. about the ways this two-way economy and knowledge was working. And it was critically important that this was happening along there. Yet another and quite unusual strategy is about speaking out. This is Joe Anderson. He was Ellen's son, so that's Biddy's son. And I'm not sure what's that might be somebody's cell phone, but anyway. So his brother was, Charles Chevelle was making movies at that stage on the sand hills at Cronulla. And so Joe Anderson, who used to speak on soapboxes and on corners in the city and talk about Aboriginal people's ownership of land, ended up on Sydney Sound News Review. So in 1933, there is a Sydney Sound News Review, very badly cut, of Joe Anderson standing on the bank of Saltpan Creek talking about Aboriginal land. He calls himself King Burriga because that is the name of his grandfather. Biddy was first, went down towards Wollongong and lived with Paddy Burriga, and he was Paddy Burriga, was Ellen's father and Ellen Senior's father. And Joe refers to himself as King Burriga, and he starts off by saying Aboriginal people had kings and queens in their own right, long before white men came to this country. So he's demanding a recognition of equivalence and then demanding respect on that basis. And then he goes on to say there's plenty of fish in the river for all of us and land to grow all we want. So he's saying we are the owners, but we will share it with you, which is a very common sentiment among many Indigenous peoples about demanding recognition, demanding respect, but being prepared to work constructively with non-Indigenous people. But he says we want more than white man's charity. We want the right to live. And it's a very powerful statement, even though it's a pretty badly cut. You can imagine what Sydney Sound News Reviews were like in 1933. It's clumsily cut, but it's a very powerful statement. A final strategy is just staying there, being around. Now, in the 1950s, this area to the east of Saltpan Creek, this swampy area, some of it was taken up and filled in as a golf course. And then in the war, it was set up as an American Army hospital. And the area was called Herne Bay, which some of you might know is that area in Kent, on the coast of England, eastern coast of England, and where settlers had come. So this area of Herne Bay became the name of not only the American Army Hospital, but after the war it became a housing commission hostel. And it was used to slum clear many people who were in crowded inner city slum areas, many of whom, of course, were Indigenous. And so you get a whole lot of people coming to these areas, which are there where the brown circle is, to the Herne Bay Housing Commission hostel. Now, when that closed down, oh, sorry, wrong arrow, the people there were moved in different directions, but they stayed close to the river. They chose to stay close to the river. One group of people were the Smith family, who had come from Wellington originally, lived in Redfern, Aboriginal people who actively identified as Aboriginal and who retained their links to Wellington in New South Wales, which is up on the Central Plains. But by this stage, they were growing up. You can see the girls were growing up in the late 1950s, early 1960s. They married along the river. They had children along the river. They saw themselves as becoming deeply responsible for that country too. And they took up very active roles on the land councils. Bert Groves was another man who came from Western New South Wales, had been living in Redfern, had come to the city for work, and who had been slum cleared to Herne Bay and who left there just to go across the river a little way across, and he founded Kirinari, which was a hostel for young Aboriginal men. And the final destination was for many people, including, this is this little boy that you saw in that earlier picture. This is Tom Williams Jr. That his family is sent to La Perouse, which is one of the few areas of an Aboriginal settlement which was allowed by the government to remain. It's on the inner part of the eastern edge of Botany Bay. And he stays and he becomes, as I said, an activist in the 1960s and 70s around the whole of the inner Sydney area. So those are 4 strategies by which Aboriginal people stayed in that country. They drew in new people, new Indigenous people from other areas. They taught stories and language, and they taught knowledge about the more than human world. And so there's an Aboriginal presence which continues on that river very powerfully, but Europeans don't see it. So the Anglo settlers don't see it. But for them, and Tom's going to throw something at me when I go on too long.
Sorry.
That's right. Okay, so the Anglo settlers, there's a very different set of situations. Now, by the end of the Second World War, they don't fear Indigenous people any longer. The conflicts have dissipated, and Indigenous people, as I've explained, are now in positions where they're keeping their heads down and are not being seen, despite the fact that they are continuing their responsibilities to the country. For Anglo settlers, there's a whole lot of Cold War fears that we all know about. You know, communism, class, working class people were a threat to the authorities, as was considered to be the case. And there was much more popular culture. There was popular culture coming from the United States, and there was ideas about working class youth particularly being dangerous. And the identity groups of bodgies and widgies were taking off, and Tom and others will remember them. And these were regarded as threats to the stability. They were highly desired by...
No, but they were all around our suburbs as we speak.
Yeah.
So it wasn't posh.
No, indeed. Indeed, but they were very frightening. But there had been the Second World War, which had, because of the Japanese expansion through Southeast Asia, the Netherlands, East Indies, and others, there was a fear of invasion which had melded with the anxiety about the fears of communism. And the federal government had made decisions to increase industrialisation and to increase the level of population in Australia, across Australia. But the Georges River, because it had so many unfarmed spaces, was an ideal spot to put all the new factories, as well as the new housing developments and the new people. So the Georges River in the post-war period suffered quite heavily from pollution because of the new factories, and also because of the increased population. This was a working class area. So whereas sewage infrastructure had been established on the northern shore of Sydney, which is a more flat area, a more higher income area, and with local government which could argue more effectively with state authorities, there had been sewage infrastructure established throughout much of the northern suburbs, but not in the southern suburbs. So along the Georges River, the increased population, which was largely sited there, they were migrant workers who were being brought in to work in the factories, which were placed there, but sewage, human waste, ran directly into the river. So the water became more polluted in the river. But on top of that, there were economic changes after the Second World War, and a shift to consumption and the emergence of the packaging industry. So the amount of household garbage just exploded. And I've done some interviewing with people who were health inspectors for the local government councils, like Bankstown and Canterbury. And they just had no idea what to do with this garbage. There was no state or federal responsibility about garbage disposal. This was a council responsibility. And it horrified people. As one of the one of the health inspectors said, look, it wasn't that we just wanted to dig out a few more mangroves and swamps. We didn't know what to do with this garbage. We didn't know where to put it. But the solution for, well, I might just before that point out that this is a co-created history. So what is happening with the pollution and the increased nitrogen because of the sewage flowing into the river is that the mangroves are expanding. And the mangroves are actually expanding a little bit before the Second World War, and they start expanding dramatically after the Second World War. And at the same time, as Neil Santiman and other researchers demonstrating, you've got early impacts of climate change which are raising the water levels, which are keeping mangroves inundated for longer, and they're expanding for that reason. And it's not working so well for the salt marshes. So the mangroves are expanding in ways which are seen as threatening, not just to the salt marsh, which is behind it, it's expanding onto salt marsh country, but also for the Australian soldiers who, like the New Zealand soldiers who were fighting in Southeast Asia. For the first time ever, Australian soldiers had only ever fought in Palestine and the Middle East. Their first encounters with dark and entangled growth had been in Southeast Asia in the war, and as well as North Queensland sometimes, and again the fear of Indigenous peoples. But in the Second World War, fear of the Japanese soldiers had been acute, and many of the ex-servicemen came back to serve in suburban local government, and they saw this mangrove expansion as deeply threatening. So there was some sort of post-traumatic syndrome stuff happening, which is mentioned in some of the newspapers by this disturbing expansion of mangroves. And at the same time, there's also a desire to do something about their expansion, which would enhance the reputation of the councils. So this is Salt Pan Creek in 1930, the top of Salt Pan Creek, and the mangroves are the dark area. This is 1986, and you can see what the mangroves have done. They've expanded dramatically, but at the same time, you've had the reduction of the salt marsh also dramatically from housing development because the population's increased. But nobody's noticing that. They're mainly noticing the mangrove expansion. And the mangroves are become the bête noire of the councils. But the salt marsh at the same time is decreasing, and the salt marsh is incredibly important for the environmental health of the whole wetlands area. What does the council do? The council burns the rubbish by and large. So the rubbish gets piled up, mangroves get chopped out, rubbish gets piled up on top of the salt marsh, and ultimately and eventually it gets, steamrolled. And what does it get turned into? Playing fields for disciplined sport. You can see the goalposts there very faintly, and the rest of it's flat and boring. But playing fields was something which were being advocated by local sports clubs, and it was a wonderful way to discipline working class youth. A bit of competitive sport was what was needed. And so there was a council saw this as being an advantage to them to be putting in playing fields, even though many of the residents were very unhappy about the council dumping rubbish close to them. And many more residents were disturbed at the idea of this bushland area. Many of the people in these early groups I'm going to talk to you about now weren't all that excited about mangroves being sustained. They wanted the rest of the bushland. They wanted the salt marsh, and they wanted the bush, the salt-tolerant growth around like the Mangalukas and the others. They've been places for informal, relaxed community socialising for picnics. So these strategies by councils, which were really accelerated in the 1950s and the early 1960s, and I can remember those piles of burning rubbish from my childhood in the late 60s, the late 50s and early 60s around Pasteur. This strategy generated three really important environmental movements which have been ignored essentially. If you look at the conservation histories and environmental histories of Australia, do you see suburban environmental movements in the 1960s and 70s? No, you don't. You see wilderness movements with people who could go to areas which they argued were pristine and have never changed. You don't see stories about the local suburban groups who tried to defend areas in along their damaged rivers. These rivers were seen as being of no to the big conservation movements. This is George Jacobson there with the dogs, and you know, Tom will know one of his sons, Coljoy, possibly, and maybe other people will have heard of him too. But Coljoy was a really big rock and roll sensation in the 1950s and 60s, and he was a local boy. They came from East Hills, and this is an area where people tried tenaciously for many years to get a national park along the river to try and save those areas, which were mangrove and salt marsh wetland areas, as well as the associated bush. This suburban environmentalism is still, people still get together. The Picnic Point Regatta Association, called Picnic Point because it was one of these informal socialising areas. This group still gets together. That's one of George Jacobson's daughter there with the blonde hair in that group down the bottom. And the older group individuals there are people who are in this Picnic Point Regatta Association. And they wrote letters and they wrote to politicians and they wrote petitions, and they actually won a national park along the river in 1961, but then they lost it in 67 because the state government decided that the river was too damaged and the vegetation wasn't pristine enough and it wasn't big enough. And so they lost it to great distress, and they're still disturbed about it to this day. Another one of the movements was the Limekiln Bay Residents Protest, which is a little bit further and a little bit later. And by this stage, no question, mangroves had become the big focus. One of the people who was involved in this campaign, a really lovely fellow called David Coffin, who gave me all of his papers and documents in one of these wonderful little local archives, which is really important. But he said that the council, as a Hurstville council this was, it's a little bit further downstream than Bankstown, had no hesitation in declaring that everybody who was progressive at all was a communist. And that was their argument, that anybody who wanted to defend these wetland areas must be a communist. And so they went to the local press declaring that we were communists defending a mosquito-ridden swamp, was what they told me. And this is what the adjacent council at Cogra, one of the councillors, said. It's not right to call them conservationists. We're going to make up a new name for them, mangrovites. Why should they want to conserve a dirty, stinking mass at Polton Park, which was Oakley Bay, the next bay down, not an asset to the community? Perhaps we can see if we can find a patch of mud for them to wild. So it's that level of vitriol and the accusations about them being communists, which was disturbed. These were little suburban families. And I think it's important to recognise that these were communities where further up the river, mostly working class, tradespeople. Around Oakley Bay, you've got some teachers, some tradespeople, other workers, labourers. These are not affluent communities, and they're communities which saw the local ministers and the local councillors as being significant figures. And here they were being accused of being communists because they were trying to defend their patch of the river. And that persisted. They used the strategies which were around at the time. So they drew on the anti-conscription and the anti-Vietnam War conflicts which were occurring at the time. They went to the press, they went to the unions, but the Municipal Employees Association that was around the Georges River wasn't interested in the way that the inner city builders labourers had been, who generated the greenbacks. So they didn't get much joy from the unions. But they proposed alternatives. They also stood for local council, and they got a few people up, but they proposed alternatives. The next Oakley Bay, as I've said, campaign had, again, a different set of strategies. They drew in the scientists. There were early ecologists, and there are interesting people in the New South Wales Department of Fisheries, which was just getting going then. This is Don Francois, who's a Canadian, who had come, and he's not interested in conserving native species. He introduces fish into the rivers because they're good for sportsmen. He's interested in fishing, but he's interested in healthy rivers, healthy environments to support fishing. And his the ecologists, the aquatic biologists who are working with him in the fisheries department begin to argue that there needs to be environmental testing of the rivers, pollution testing. So the Open Bay group, the Polton Park group, also go to schools, and those stickers there were the school kids at the time remember taking the stickers to school and pasting them on school bags and whiteboards and things, blackboards as they were then. And there was the beginnings of environmental education. This was a project, the Inspect project was a project which was taking place in a number of schools where students were asked to identify the environmental conditions around them and look at the threats and look at the ways to improve them. So this is the report of the Inspect group in Canberra, and that Bad Luck Dead Duck title comes from one of the kids who noticed the number of dead ducks along the river in the Canberra area and said, well, that's obviously what it is. Now, I can see we're looking at the time, so I'll be really quick here, but the rest is important. A lot of the alternatives which were proposed by the Anglo groups have since been adopted. They include rubbish recycling and filtering stormwater and the Bradley method of bush regeneration and bank regeneration, I'm sure you might know about. So one of the things I think is interesting about some of these alternatives is that they actually perpetuate the socialisation, the sociality that so many of these local groups were seeking to conserve. A lot of the competitive sports grounds still got played, put in, and competitive sport was played. But a lot of these strategies for regen movements drew on that desire for sociality. But my final 5 minutes are going to be spent pointing out that Anglo settlers were not the only people using this river. So this case study, while it might be specifically Sydney oriented, will have ramifications in places in New Zealand certainly, as well as in other parts of Australia. So we found in our research about the Georges River National Park that not only were Anglo settlers who saw themselves as owning that area present, nor was it only Indigenous peoples who were there in the spaces and not being noticed, but they were not the people using the parklands. The people using the parklands were recently immigrant groups who've been, many brought in to work in the factories along the river. Arabic speakers, particularly Vietnamese speakers, later Bangladeshis. There had been Chinese Australians in the area for even longer, and all of them had an interest in the environment, and they were the people in the parklands on the river. But their views about environment were being ignored by the National Parks Service, by the environmental authorities. And I'll just quickly run through the facts that a lot of the migrants said, yeah, sure, we use the parks because we need to relax. Their work was often hard manual labour. So it was important to come into the parks. People didn't have a lot of money. Parklands were good places for meeting people. But there were other issues too. And for both Mandaeans and for Muslims, who were two of the four Abrahamic groups. So you've got the Judaic groups, you've got Christians who emerged on the basis of the Judaic religions. You have got Mandaeans who follow John the Baptist and who practice full body immersion often, like a number of times a year, and Muslims who practice the physical use of water for ablutions before prayers a number of times each day. Now, for each of those two groups, water has retained a practical value, whereas for Jews and Christians, water is largely symbolic. It's used at baptisms and in other ways, but it's not a practical everyday necessity. To think about water quality and the sharing and practices of using water. So there were very real interests in thinking about water quality for these groups along the river. The traditions of Muslims, for example, link parklands and the world beyond, within which humans live, but the natural world, with the universal. So the idea of Australian nationalists running around with flags and arguing that the national is represented by Cronulla is just really silly, because for Muslims who were coming, and indeed for Mandaeans who were baptising, for Muslims who were in prayer groups in the river, who on the riverlands and preferring to practice in the open air, this was a link directly to a universal, transcendent being, rather than to any national identity. And it was an important way to think about nature, and for the reasons that you might want to conserve it. And you've also got people making new homes, people sharing social occasions or ceremonial occasions, like the naming of this baby in this photograph here, or social conditions here. And here, just a little further upstream, you've got many Muslims are very active members of the Clean Up Australia Day sessions, and they are actively interested in sustaining these areas as open and informal spaces for people to gather. Final point is to suggest that another more than human species that we need to think about, whereas mangroves are endemic, they belong on the Georges River. They have always been there for as long as anybody knows. Wild fennel hasn't been. Fennel is one of the things which has been brought, perhaps accidentally, but which is a great delight for Arabic speakers, because it can be used as a herb for cooking. And this is Esham Abdo explaining to one of the National Parks officers about how fennel is used. And here is a group of people who are using it in a barbecue park. It's part of the sociality which Arabic-speaking Australians take part in these parks, and it's one of the ways of building attachment. I'll quickly go through Vietnamese Australians who are largely excluded, or have been, from recreational activities like bowling and other sorts of things for which white Australian, settler Australian descendants in the area would participate in. Racism kept people out. So most of the Vietnamese we interviewed said they'd fished far more in Australia than they ever fished in Vietnam, even though fishing is regarded as a characteristic of Vietnamese groups. They fished in Australia along the Georges River because they couldn't get into the other recreational activities. And they used that fishing to teach young kids like Hoi Pham, whom we interviewed, who was a researcher with us actually. Hoi Pham learnt a lot about Vietnam from sharing fishing with his father, but his mother talked a lot about Vietnam as well, and obviously visibly enjoyed the river and the presence to remember her homeland. But there was also a lot of teaching that went on about inquiring, asking, talking to other fishers, because fishing is one of the places, and I'll be really quick, fishing is one of the ways that you can talk to people from various ethnic groups without being abused or attacked, given sort of current prevailing racism. So both Arabic speakers and Vietnamese Australians used fishing and travelling around to explore their country, get to know it. So despite the fact that they were being told that they didn't belong, they took active steps to learn the country, and they had strong interests in taking responsibility in it. So I'll finish on that note, which is that human attachment is an important part of building sustainability, and it needs to be seen in its historical context as a way of understanding why people want to care for country. And I'll finish there.
Okay, we've got 3 minutes. So who's got an absolutely burning question?
It'll take time.
Yeah, well, it was a complex and multi-layered story, which was absolutely fascinating. So thank you. I think somebody? Anybody? Don't be shy. Yes.
Thanks for that. That was really great. My name's Keith Holler. I'm a lecturer in the psychology department here, and I'm actually doing some work similar kind of to this with some students around knowledge of the area of Bay of Islands up in Northland, so and how that relates to adolescent resilience and self-esteem, particularly Māori youth up there. And I just kind of think that your stuff is really interesting. And you mentioned at the very beginning about how environmentalists might think of a place as being fixed as one. Is that a thing that actually happened? I guess when you said it, I was surprised, because from social psychology, I'm very much probably in line with your thinking that there's no, particularly within a social environment, a social environment kind of inherently ambiguous. Different people have different meanings around it. I was surprised that that was a perspective that you said perhaps a common thing within environmental settings, or people that take that kind of viewpoint.
Look, I think it's very common in lots of areas. It's at lots of walks of life, I guess, and lots of disciplines, to think about places, because our lifespans are so relatively short. We think about places as having particular qualities that we care about, and we invest our idea of those qualities into the place itself. So people might think about, the landscapes of grandeur and valleys and waterfalls and things, or particular stands and forests and things like that. But as biologists, people who are ecologists will know that there has been change over a long time period in the non-human biology, whether it's botany or zoology, and as there is with humans themselves. And then you've got an accelerating pace of change with contemporary economies, perhaps, and settlement patterns. But as well as that, you've got what Doreen Massey's work has been so important in doing, I think, is making us recognise that nature and culture are not separate, that our understanding of the more than human world, our place within it, so that it's human and more than human, relates to our memories and our pasts. And that's what we see very strongly in these groups of, between Indigenous groups and Anglo-Australians on the Georges River and the immigrant groups on the Georges River. We see quite diverse bodies of knowledge being attached and embedded into their understanding of this river. And that they bring with them also bodies of environmental knowledge. And so engaging people's interest in the river, whether or not it fits somebody's particular pattern or paradigm of what that river should be, is really important in building the sort of motivation to care for it, which is what I think that Black Musket Park image is like. And indeed, this one here, that group in the middle, that's a bunch of young Aboriginal kids, young Indigenous kids from La Perouse. Now, as will have been obvious from the Williams family's removal to La Perouse, there are people there from all over the place, particularly from the north coast of New South Wales. But they live on that country, they live on the Georges River, and they're building a sense of responsibility. That's the Towra team, and they are the rangers who care for Towra Point, that area that William Rana came from. So people build responsibilities, and bringing them in, recognising their attachment and their interest is a pretty important part of building motivation for sustainability.
Well, so, what Australia's response to those stories when you tell them? Are they open to those?
Well, we haven't got too far with the National Park Service, I have to tell you. We've published some of this material. I can send Tom the links. We've published a booklet about community views from the Arabic-speaking community. So that's both religions we've discussed, mainly Sunni Muslims, and a booklet about the Vietnamese community's responses. What they can do in parks, what they want to do when they're obstructed from doing. Alison Cadzow and I published a book about the Indigenous presence along the river to the present day, or to the 2000s. And I've just published a book for which I've got a leaflet there I forgot to bring out, called Georges River Blues, which is about these suburban campaigns, which have not been recognised. I mean, they're really not, are they?
They've been missed by environmental historians almost completely.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's
I'll
right.
actually I'll hand out this week, that's how I just remembered.
Miranda wants to ask a question before.
And anybody else can ask questions too.
I just wondered about the sort of difficult decisions that people are sort of beginning to engage around these.
You have to speak up because I'm very deaf.
Sorry.
So
I'm wondering about how sort of the difficult, the kind of dark side of some of these stories and the difficult decisions people make faced with and taking the face of species. So New Zealand is not a predator-free project, right? Which highlights particular species that need to be killed while other species that we love, cats, for instance, sort of get off of it scot-free. And I wonder, and I'm quite interested in whether there are any emerging or even sort of original ones that different things. So imagine you've got the example of the phenol. There's quite complex conflicts that would emerge around whether or not such species are to be valued whether we got
the approach of the councils to the mangroves and indeed of national parks to the fennel, because the fennel is an exotic introduced species, is to eradicate them. So the mangroves were a nuisance and evoked all these anxieties. They needed to be cut back completely and destroyed to the playing fields. Whereas the many other people today would argue that mangroves need to be retained, but because they're essential for immature fish, for example, and fish breeding, but that they can be controlled and managed in such a way as to maintain salt marsh and other species. And fennel in Central Australia, Indigenous peoples have got words and uses for and symbolic meanings for rabbits, for example, and camels, both of which are introduced. But it is quite possible to engage culturally with creatures like this in ways which can be in which their presence can be managed. So recognising change in environments and recognising the complex network of motivations that involves managing predation so that it doesn't dominate other species, but on the other hand, recognising values and human motivations for exercising protection and defensive is really important. And that seems to me an important part of thinking about sustainability. Humans are a part of this process, and there's a lot of people who are excluded from decision making about environments who nevertheless really need them and take part in them. So how can negotiations occur which recognise those interests? And as a cat lover, I would, I mean, clearly, we don't want cats killing nice native creatures. On the other hand, the role of companion animals is really important for humans in every society. And so managing the ways in which they're able to move around is important and something that people can take on, but they're only going to be motivated to take it on if they feel attached and if they feel their views are respected. And quite frankly, the National Parks and Wildlife Service in Australia hasn't really got to that point yet.
Thank you. Well, I suppose we better stop it there because you've all got other things to do. So thank you so much for fascinating paper. By the way, coincidentally, the part of Auckland I grew up in, Westmere, had lots of mangroves, and they're still there. So they're not just a Sydney or further north in Australia phenomenon.
Right.
They're the top part of the country, including the Bay of Islands that we heard about before. You have some of these rather different forms of fauna,
Yes.
or flora at least, to go with the fauna. So yeah, what's fascinating, I just love the holistic way you went about it, and all the levels and layers you put in, which
Sorry.
oh, no, that's all right. Well, we better let them all go now because they probably all want to go.
I'm going to leave this PowerPoint and